So good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I am Courtney Cayola, the Client Services Specialist here at Commercial Investigations. And joining me today is Michelle Pyan, President of Commercial Investigations. This is our first installment of CI's Michelle Unscripted. Michelle has over 20 years experience as a private investigator and business owner, and her knowledge and passion make her a leader in the industry. And today, she is kind enough to share some of her information with us. So I just wanted to start the conversation off today by asking what you have done to make commercial investigations different than all of the background screening companies that are out there.
That's a interesting question. We are very unique when it comes to the background screening industry. You know, I have a number of years' experience in human resources as well. So the combination has allowed us to put together a process and procedures for our clients that is very flexible and very compliant as well. Some of the things that make us different, I think one of the things is if somebody's used another background screening company, basically you have a few packages to choose from, and those are searches that you get, and your operators, your end users are required to put in the requested searches. With the company, we sit down with our clients, we develop a policy, and we develop the parameters of that policy, which is what searches are involved, the time frame involved, and what we do. To the background check being initiated, the user basically initiates the background check, and we run the searches in conjunction in an order to allow us to validate identifiers, their human intervention process. So unlike other companies, we make sure you're compliant with your policy across the board with everybody. You don't have to worry about training new users on how to add the right searches for your background checks or variations should you be hiring a management level person with a different package. So we take, it's a liability shift too. It's a liability that we're taking on to make sure that you're compliant and not discriminatory in your practices. But we're all the experts in this, so it makes a lot of sense to shift that responsibility for having a new recruiter from the background check process, including adding, additional counties if somebody lived outside of New York State. That's a parameter established in your policy that our investigators make sure is covered, and it's not another additional task put on your recruiters to do.
And when you're talking about that, one of the things that you touched on was human intervention, and I know that we say commercial investigations gives an intervention with an investigative approach. Could you just tell us a little bit about what that means?
Sure, and that's an interesting term that's resurfaced internally a lot lately. We've been doing a lot of RFPs because we're a certified woman-owned business, and there's a big push for more contracting with organizations like ours. It's been coming up, and one of the things we need to do is differentiate ourselves. Since the beginning, we've talked about human intervention with an investigative approach. I also mentioned just briefly, we know what order searches should be run in. So we start with origin. All of our new clients and the majority of our existing clients start all background checks with origin. So it validates the identity, validates date of birth, name variations, name, address, social security number. So we make sure all of that is right. The information goes and gathers the other searches required. So if you had an operator in your HR department add all those searches, they're going to go off and all be done at the same time. We'll have the industry average turnaround time by having our human intervention. Our quality is a lot higher because of it, because we catch typos in a social security number, the date of birth that was wrong, something like that right up front before we're going to run a motor vehicle search. So if motor vehicle is part of the package, that's the second search we run because that also validates date of birth. So what order searches should be run to validate identifiers, and we make sure everything is accurate before we go and tap into databases like a Healthcare Comply Plus search or a Global Scan search or other type of a database search we may be doing, or even calling the educational facility, and you've got all the names there. So if somebody graduated 20 years ago, we name variations that the registrar's office can check it, because more than likely their primary name, if they're a female, is not going to be the name they went to school with. The human intervention is, almost, looked at up front, but it's also looked at on the back end in conjunction, because the more searches you can run, the better picture you get of a person. And that's why we've developed Cursory Indicator and a couple of our other searches to keep cost per search low, but you can have a really robust package with a lot of different searches in that package.
Part of that with the human intervention, I think you hear a lot in the industry, the term data broker, and, but we're a private investigative agency. So to just talk about like the difference between those.
There's a number of large organizations in our industry. We're a medium-sized background screening company. We'll probably never be at the capacity of these large background screening companies, but most of them are data brokers. Basically, nobody ever looks at the background check. Nobody ever, there's no human intervention whatsoever. Thus, there can't even be an investigative approach because there's no thought process behind it. HR recruiter or volunteer manager, whomever it is, enters the information, it takes a couple of databases, spits some results, and if something's wrong or something's not right, that end user has to be aware enough to realize that. And these people aren't educated in kind of stuff like our investigators are and everything. So that's a lot that we can add there. The data brokers, they also do simultaneous notice, where we do primary source verification. That's one of the main reasons why we are part of the concerned CRA group. With primary source verification, we are going to the source of the data we get from the database and validating the information. So you're getting the most up-to-date information as required by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. The data brokers do is they take the least expensive, least time-consuming way of complying with the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and they do, I believe the Act calls it contemporaneous notice. So what happens is if their data shows results that could be the person, and there's a name match that are validated beyond a name match when it comes to this. If you've got the name match, it's a notice situation, then the client, end user gets the results, and the subject also gets the results. That's where simultaneous notice comes into play. So it doesn't require them to validate anything more. It's just a name match, and they're passing it on. And like in a volunteer setting, use the example of like Mike Smith, who all he wanted to do was coach his son's youth baseball team. And there's a lot of Mike Smiths, and some of them are sex offenders. And a data broker did the background check and came back with results, didn't bother to validate that the initial didn't match, the date of birth didn't match, sent the information to the local youth organization, and at the same time sent it to this Mike Smith. Well, it's really embarrassing for Mike Smith that this organization got all this information and it's not him. How do you go about, rectifying your reputation that has just been injured by a report that isn't even you? So that's damage that gets done with the data broker methodology of doing background checks. They're very inexpensive, but sometimes you really get what you pay for.
Right. I think what you touched on, that we're a part of the concerned CRAs, I think, staying educated, educating the staff and yourself, being a part of a lot of different organizations, that's up too. And you just talk a little bit about that, the different organizations we're a part of. And
that's a good question. So in our industry, the National Association of Professional Background Screeners, it's NABS for short, we're a member of that company, and the organization is only a few months older than the years that we are. The National Association of Professional Background Screeners have basic and an advanced certification under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Most employees, once they hit 6 months, all of our employees have the basic certification, and there's a number of us, like myself, Melissa, and Craig, that have the advanced certification, and everybody's on track to get the advanced as well. So it's an educational process and a test-taking process and a certification in our industry, and we have a high percentage of employees that have attained one or both levels of that compared to other background screening companies. Mm-hmm. Now, there's the concerned CRA, as we mentioned, on offshore information. In order to be a concerned CRA, it's a very small subgroup of background screening companies, and you have to do primary source verification, which we've always done. It's expensive and can be time-consuming, but it's the right thing, and that's one of our values is, do the right thing always. But then you can't offshore data. So we're not sending data to India for employment verification, and there's no privacy laws guarding that data. And here we just send name, date of birth, social security number, and address. So we don't violate people's privacy because we don't ship data overseas for processing. Everything is processed. Everything is processed in our headquarters in New York.
Mm-hmm. Another, we're hearing much lately about lawsuits going on, in our industry, and because of, screening being done incorrectly, and, I'm hearing what clients can do to protect themselves from that happening, and, how we can help them with that.
Sure, and that's interesting, Courtney, and we just wrote a really good article for CI Times, and we were talking about it as well. And I've got some presentations coming up later this year that are going to talk a little bit about some of these lawsuits. The lawsuits come back to the basics. What's happening is organizations are, like OC is getting involved. The FTC has always been involved, but there was created the Consumer Fraud Protection Bureau, so they also govern industries. So these organizations are reaching out and making sure that people are compliant with these laws because it's a consumer protection situation. Some of the ones, you would think it's very basic, but under Fair Credit Reporting Act, you give a disclosure, they're going to do a background check, and it needs to refer to a consumer report. You have to get the authorization. Now, that can all be in one form, and that's what we call our consent form. Some people call it release, some people call it a disclosure, some people call it an authorization. But actually, it's a consent form. It includes the disclosure and the authorization. And then if you're not going to hire somebody based upon a report that a background screening company does for you, you need to do a pre-adverse action notice, including a copy of the report, a copy rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and in New York, Article 23A. And you have to send that off to the subject, and about 10 business days later, you need to send the adverse action notice. So they're very basic processes and procedures, but this is what the courts are looking at. And they found ones like, Cheese, Dollar General. These are a few names that, is it Fresh Market? It's one of the largest market wholesale, maybe Whole Foods, I think it was. Under the law, the consent release, whatever you want to call this disclosure and authorization form, must be a standalone document, and it cannot contain contemporaneous information. Well, organizations are throwing a disclaimer of liability language in there. And so the person signing off and saying, well, you and the background screening company aren't liable, responsible for anything that may happen in the background screening process. So that's interesting. You can't do that. That's something outside of the form. It's specific. The form must be just the disclosure and authorization. So one of the big things that's happening is people have this liability. And I find it interesting because under the FCRA, we all have liability protection anyway. Our clients, we do, and people supplying us information. Unless willful and malicious, there's very little action that the subject take of a legal nature that's going to get you in trouble. For some lawyers, one day decided to put this, liability protection in these authorization docs. That's coming up a lot. The other thing that's been coming up, and this is interesting, is, like we have our electronic consent portal, and people have gone electronic with their application consent and application, the whole process. we make sure that there's a distinct break between the application and the consent form. We have a blank page on one of our integrations that we have, and then they know that you are now going to the consent form. So just making it clear there. But one of the recent cases that I just read last night had a hard copy application that had the disclosure and authorization as part of their employment application. And it's clearly got to be a standalone document. So the EEOC is going after organizations that aren't being compliant with these basic requirements of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Now, it's also the Consumer Protection Bureau and the FTC that's going after organizations for non-compliance. So basically, you get back to the basics. Let's take a look at this. And on the line, whether you're a client of ours or not, you want to talk through this, I welcome you to call me directly for a one-on-one to just talk through your process to make sure you have the right forms. I realize there's a lot of different verbiage in our industry, and there's not a lot of standards. You're questioning something, please give me a call.
And I have a lot of the lawsuits are around the consent form, but I've also recently seen the EEOC talking about Title VII and discrimination in our industry, and there was a recent case, I think, where that was brought up. Can you just talk about that and how it's affecting?
Sure. This was an interesting one. So Crawford is a healthcare organization, but what it specializes in is environmental services. So it's essentially a live-in janitronic type of org for healthcare clients. They have a background screening process, and when they get the criminal records back in a report, they go through an assessment. Just like most of you who get a criminal record, you're going to look at it, you're going to make an assessment, and especially if you're in New York and you got to do Article 23A. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act requires certain organizations to keep record-keeping requirements of anything that could be discriminatory when it comes to your hiring practices. So in the Crawford case, I believe that they didn't have either or a lot of record or no record-keeping requirements, but it was something with the fact it wasn't that they were discriminating, but it was the fact that they weren't keeping records under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So it took background checks, it took Fair Credit Reporting Act, and went all the way back to 1964, Title VII Civil Rights Act, and brought it all together. So it's a very broad view of it, and it's a very interesting interpretation that, when you run background checks, that's an assessment, and the criminal information is part of an assessment process. And if you have record-keeping requirements under Title VII, that should be included. I don't think Crawford's been decided yet, but that's the gist of the complaint that's out there at this point in time.
I just wanted to touch on too was, I think commercial investigations, they're going to be, innovative. And I know that we say that a lot, and I was just wondering if you could just explain, what makes us innovative and why.
Sure. That's a great question because, our vision is to be the most innovative educational background investigations partner. And with the years of experience I've had in the industry and seeing the evolution of it, we've been at the forefront with a couple of things. Since 1998, we've had and been testing New York State data, which since 2010 has been called Cursory Indicator New York on the retail side, and we also wholesale that to other background screening companies called Pointer File New York. So we're instrumental in gathering this data. It competes with the Office of Court Administration, which charges $65 a name. So it's a very cost-effective way, like for nonprofits to do background checks. They can't afford $65 a name on volunteers. So we've got Cursory Indicator New York. We developed the VolCheck, which is a volunteer-controlled platform. The volunteer controls the background check and can share it with multiple organizations at which they volunteer. You have 4 or 5 different organizations over the course of a year that may run a background check on the same person. Right. It's all that. It shifts it to the volunteer to control who has access to it, and the volunteer pays once, and it's good for a period of time, and can share it with as many organizations as they want. So that's VolCheck. That's epic. There's nothing else out there, and we've had it since years now. Yeah. Yep. We've had VolCheck for a while. Our vigilant, it's a much monitoring service. There's other monitoring services out there, but New York State data we've made into a vigilant service. So a lot of what we do is very innovative. I have a very good understanding of the industry and where it's going. Cyber investigations.
Right.
We ran those in 2006. It wasn't years later that the FTC came out and said, well, as you're getting the consent and doing this, that, and that under the Fair Credit Report Act, you can do that. Well, we did it because organizations are doing these Google cyber type of investigations, and they're seeing all this information. We talk about Title VII and discrimination. They see all this information that's discriminatory, so why should they do it when there's organizations like us that can protect them and get them the adverse information they're really looking for without exposing them to age or religion or other factors of an individual that they're not looking for. So we were one of the first background screening companies to offer what we call cyber investigation, but it's essentially like a Google type of search, a social media search.
Great. Well, a lot of information. I really thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us, and I just wanted to see if anyone has any questions or comments for Michelle. Questions? No comments? Anything else you want to know? All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. Like I said, this was our first installment of Michelle Unscripted, and I hope that you can join us on future ones. And if anyone has any ideas on any future webinars, anything they'd like to know, please feel free to call or email us at any time and let us know that. We'd love to hear. So everyone, have a great day. Thanks, everybody.